Evening of December 8, 2001, 57-year-old Dr. Robert Schwartz stood in the kitchen of his farmhouse outside of Leesburg, Virginia, stirring strips of pork and vegetables in his frying pan. Robert could hear the rain beating against the windows, and the sound made him feel at peace. He had the heat cranked up, and he was wearing his most comfortable sweatpants. There was nowhere he would rather be on a rainy winter night than inside this home, which had been in his wife's family for generations. He checked the pork, which was almost done, and he reached for a single plate out of the cabinet. Robert used to love cooking, and until just a few years ago, he always made big portions to feed his family of 5. But his wife had died 4 years earlier from cancer, and her death had sent all 3 of their kids spiraling, especially their youngest, Clara, who was only 15 at the time. Clara was the one who actually found her mom on the morning she died, and she had fallen into a deep depression afterwards. Robert had been worried he might never pull her out, but recently, Clara seemed to have gotten into a really good groove. She was 19 now, and she'd found a tight-knit group of friends who all loved Renaissance fairs, where people dress up like they're from medieval times. Clara had created a fantasy game called Underworld, and the kids all spent a lot of time playing it. Robert didn't really understand the game, but he was thrilled that Clara had finally discovered something to be passionate about. These days, Clara was away at college, along with her older sister, Michelle, and her older brother, Jesse. And Robert was proud of how he had pulled the kids through their mother's death. He felt like he had sent them out into the world as basically happy and capable people, which was a goal that had seemed very far away in the early period of their grief. He did miss them, though. Most nights now, he ate alone, with the creaking of the old house to keep him company. His kids had always complained about all the noises the house made, but Robert liked it. He spent his days working long hours as a biophysicist studying DNA at a science and technology firm called the Center for Innovative Technology, where the offices and laboratories were white and brightly lit and pretty quiet. Robert loved his work, but the environment was a little sterile for his taste. So, coming home to an overgrown farmhouse way out in the woods, where vines grew up the stone walls and the floorboards squeaked and the nearest neighbors were more than a quarter mile away, was a nice contrast. Now, he set his plate down and reached into a bag of tortillas on the counter. He put 2 in the middle of the plate, and then he started to tip the frying pan to scoop out the meat and vegetables on top. But before he could turn off the burner and head to the table, he heard a knock coming from the front door. Robert frowned and craned his neck to look toward the door, which had a little window in it, but the rain made it impossible to see out. Robert did not get a lot of unexpected visitors, especially not on a stormy night like this, but he figured maybe it was just a delivery driver trying to keep a package from getting soaked. But whoever it was knocked again, and so Robert turned and walked out of the kitchen and through the front room toward the entryway. The knocking had gotten fast and loud by the time Robert made it to the front door, flipped the lock, and swung the door open. Two days later, on December 10th, 2001, at around 1:15 on Monday afternoon, a man named Sam Welsh, who lived down the street from Robert Schwartz, was loading laundry into his washing machine when his phone rang. Sam abandoned the laundry and walked into his kitchen to pick it up. When he said hello, he heard the voice of a friend, and his friend sounded pretty anxious. This friend worked at the Center for Innovative Technology, which is where Robert worked, and the friend said that Robert hadn't come into work today. He had missed an important meeting, and he wasn't answering his phone. And this was about as out of character as it was possible to get for Robert, who was famous in the field of DNA research and had actually worked on the first online database of DNA sequence information. Robert was organized, reliable, and extremely communicative. He never just went silent. So this friend asked Sam, "Can you please go to Robert's house to check to see if he's okay?" Sam didn't hesitate. He said of course he would. Then he hung up the phone, went out to his truck, and drove to Robert's farmhouse, which was about a mile away at the end of a dead-end road. When Sam pulled up, he saw Robert's car parked on the street, and a construction crew digging up Robert's driveway in front of the house. Everything looked calm and normal, which Sam found encouraging. He recognized one of the workers as another neighbor of his, so he parked his truck, hopped out, and went over to ask if the worker had seen Robert. But the worker said no. The construction crew had arrived almost 6 hours earlier at 7:30 that morning, and not only had Robert not come out to greet them all like he normally did, they hadn't actually seen any movement at all inside of his house. Now, the brief sense of relief Sam had felt when he arrived evaporated. He explained to the construction worker about the concerning call he'd just gotten, and so he asked the worker to come with him to go check on Robert. The 2 men walked down the driveway toward the farmhouse. They knocked on the front door, but nobody answered. So they went around to the side door, which Sam knew Robert usually left unlocked. Sam didn't want to just barge in, so when they got to the side door, he first knocked loudly. But again, nobody answered. Sam shot a worried look at the construction worker, and then he tried the knob. And just like he'd expected, the door was unlocked. Sam stepped inside and called out Robert's name, but the house was completely silent. So he took a few halting steps. Ahead of him, he could see the kitchen. Sam called out Robert's name again and took one more step forward, right up to the threshold of the kitchen, and then he froze. For a long second, Sam stood there completely still, not even breathing, with the construction worker a few paces behind him. Then, Sam whirled around and gave the worker a shove back towards the door. Sam was so afraid that he could barely think, but he managed to shout one single sentence: "Call the police!" Loudoun County investigator Greg Locke was sitting in a classroom in a local school near Leesburg, Virginia, halfway through his first day of a week-long police training course when his pager vibrated. And when Locke looked down at the short message blinking on his little screen, he felt his heart start to race. He stood up and gathered his things, told the instructor he was sorry but he had to go, then speed-walked out of the classroom. Locke had only been with the Loudoun County Sheriff's Department for a couple of months. He had originally planned on becoming a firefighter, but training for that position had required that he go to the local police academy. And in the police academy, Locke had realized that he actually preferred the slow, puzzle-solving nature of detective work over the fast-paced intensity of firefighting. So he had switched careers entirely and joined the sheriff's department. He started off in the crime lab, but he just transferred to the homicide unit, which was actually why he was taking this class. Now, Investigator Locke pushed open the front door of the school building where his class was happening and jogged the rest of the distance to his cruiser. He got in, turned the ignition, and peeled out of the parking lot, headed west toward the big old farmhouse in the woods. When Locke pulled up on the dead-end street, he saw the flashing blue and white lights of a sea of police cruisers. It looked like the entire sheriff's department was there. Locke got out of his cruiser and walked down the long driveway and up the front steps of the farmhouse. The front door was open, and as Locke stepped through the entryway, he could tell that the scene was pretty well covered by police and crime scene techs. So he looked for a supervisor to get a rundown of exactly what they were dealing with. Locke found his supervisor standing just outside the kitchen, staring grimly at a man's bloody body. At first glance, it was immediately clear to Locke that whatever had happened here to this man, it had been a frenzy of violence. The man's body lay face down on the floor. His clothing had been shredded in the attack, and there was so much blood that it had dried in sticky thick pools that spread out all over the hardwood. Even the bottom of the man's white socks were bloody, which Locke knew meant there must have been a struggle, because the only way for the bottom of his socks to get that soaked was if he had been bleeding heavily and then stepped in it. Locke's supervisor turned away from the body and brought Locke quickly up to speed. Their victim was Dr. Robert Schwartz, who was a well-known biophysicist, and he had been stabbed to death. It didn't appear to be a robbery, because nothing had been stolen or rifled through, and there was no sign of forced entry, which meant that, very likely, Robert had opened the door to his attacker willingly. Locke knew that a set of facts like this often meant that a murder victim had been targeted by a person they knew, rather than attacked by a random stranger. And the savagery of the stabbing itself supported that theory, because it suggested a highly emotional killer who felt true rage towards the victim. But Locke's supervisor told him there was one more thing, something incredibly bizarre. Whoever had stabbed Dr. Schwartz to death had also carved an X into the back of his neck. Locke told his supervisor that he was going to start canvassing the neighborhood, and his supervisor nodded in agreement. As Locke walked back out the front door of the farmhouse, he looked around and shook his head incredulously. This was a beautiful area. It was up in the mountains, and it was sitting right above a historic little downtown district with nice restaurants and breweries and coffee shops and a vibrant art scene. It was very hard to imagine any murder taking place here, let alone some kind of ritual killing that involved a vicious knife attack and a symbol carved into the victim's skin. The nearest house was way down the road, and as Locke reached it and climbed the front steps, he realized he couldn't even see Robert's home from here. This gave him a sinking feeling. He was afraid that the people inside of this house could not have possibly heard anything going on inside of Robert's house a quarter-mile away. None of the neighbors could have. But Locke knocked anyway, and soon a middle-aged married couple answered, looking concerned. They said they had seen all the commotion, and they asked if everything was okay. Inspector Locke just shook his head and said no. There had been an incident, but he couldn't say anything about it right now. Locke told the couple that what he had come for was to ask if they had seen or heard anything suspicious over the weekend. He watched as the couple exchanged a look. Yes, the husband said. As a matter of fact, they did. On Saturday night, during the rainstorm, a soaking wet teenage boy had come to their house asking to use the phone because his car got stuck in the mud a little ways down the road. The husband said he had looked outside and seen the car, which had a young woman and man inside, and then he said he called a towing company that he knew, and the teenager had thanked him and gone back to the car to wait, and the tow truck driver had arrived not long after. Locke scribbled this down in his notepad, then asked the husband what exactly was strange about the encounter. It wasn't uncommon at all in an area this rural for cars to get stuck. The husband nodded in agreement, but it wasn't the car getting stuck that was strange, he said. It was where the car was driving in the first place. The teenagers had gotten stuck on a dead-end road. There was literally nothing down there, except for Robert Schwartz's house. So, the husband asked, what were the teenagers doing down there? Locke left the neighbor's home and checked in by phone with his supervisor to share what he'd just heard about the kids in the mud on Saturday night. And his supervisor was instantly interested because the medical examiner had just come and collected the body, and his initial examination suggested that the murder had happened on Saturday night too. And Locke's supervisor told him that the medical examiner had also discovered something else that was pretty unusual. When he had rolled Robert's body over, he found deep marks in the wood underneath where he had been laying. This was important because it looked like the marks had been made by the knife used to kill Robert. In other words, this could not have just been a regular knife, like you would find in a regular kitchen. Instead, the knife the killer had used had such a long blade that when the killer plunged it into Robert's torso, it had gone all the way through his body and then into the floor beneath him, leaving the marks. That meant the murder weapon had a blade that was at least 2 feet long. Now, the murder weapon had not been found inside of the home, so it looked like the killer had brought the long blade with them to the house and then taken it with them when they left. To Locke and his supervisor, the idea of the murder weapon being this long, strange blade only strengthened their fear that this murder might have a ritualistic or even satanic element to it. But Locke told his supervisor that before they went down a rabbit hole of the occult, they should focus on something a bit simpler that was right in front of their faces. They should track down those teenagers and the tow truck driver. Locke got in his cruiser and drove to the office of the towing company, where he found the owner in the lobby. Locke asked him if he remembered a call on Saturday night about a carload of teenagers stuck in the mud on a dead-end street. As soon as the owner heard this, he scowled. Yeah, he said, I remember. Those kids stiffed my driver on the bill. And now, Locke felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the second suspicious thing he'd learned about the kids in the stuck car. Not only were they driving down a dead-end road they had no business being on, but they ducked out on the towing bill. Now, stiffing the driver was a crime, but Locke wondered if they had done it because they wanted to avoid giving out their real names. Locke asked the owner if he could speak to the driver, and the owner said sure, then disappeared into the back office. A few minutes later, a man in a t-shirt with the towing company's logo on it walked out into the lobby and said he was the one who helped those kids. Locke could see from the man's furrowed brow and darting eyes that he was nervous, like he had something sensitive or upsetting to say. And Locke wondered if he was about to break this case open right here, right now. The tow truck driver gestured to Locke to follow him to the far corner of the lobby furthest away from the back office where his boss was. When they got there, well out of earshot of the boss, the driver started to mumble something about how he'd gone out in the rain and unstuck the car and the kids jumped in and took off without paying, but then he stopped and looked around like he was making sure they were alone. Once he was satisfied they had real privacy, the driver leaned into Locke and said, I'll tell you something, but you can't tell my boss. Locke quickly nodded yes, completely desperate for the driver to continue. Whatever he was about to say, Locke wanted to hear it. Well, the tow truck driver said slowly, I lied. The tow truck driver explained that the kids did not stiff him on the bill. In fact, they were perfectly nice and polite, and they didn't seem upset in any way, and they had gone to an ATM to get cash to pay the bill. The driver had decided to lie about the kids running off just so he could pocket the cash. And at this, Locke felt himself deflate. He could see his theory of teenagers driving around, committing crimes, and trying to hide their identities slipping away. Locke suppressed an urge to roll his eyes at the tow truck driver, and instead promised he wouldn't say anything to the man's boss. He asked if the driver had the kids' names, and the driver said yes. He kept a log of all his jobs, so he had the driver's name and license number. He also remembered the bank they went to for the ATM. Locke scribbled down the information, thanked the tow truck driver, and then went back to headquarters. Back at his desktop computer, Locke looked up the teenage driver, whose name was Michael Fole. He was hoping to discover that this kid was some kind of serious criminal, but instead, he saw a skinny 21-year-old college student with no record. He made a pretty unlikely murder suspect. Locke leaned back, feeling disappointed. His hope for a simple explanation for the murder, instead of an occult ritual, was fading fast. He checked the time and realized it was now mid-afternoon, and he still hadn't talked to the victim's family yet. He decided he would finish running down the final details on the kids in the car the next day. Right now, he had to go find Robert Schwartz's 3 children and tell them that their father had been murdered. The drive to James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia took about 2 hours, and it was dark by the time Locke pulled onto campus. Both of Robert Schwartz's daughters, his youngest daughter Clara and her older sister Michelle, were students here. And as Locke parked in front of the residence hall, he saw the campus police officer and the university counselor he had contacted to help with the notification waiting for him. They led Locke into the residence hall, up a flight of stairs, and down a hallway to Clara's dorm. The campus police officer knocked and then stepped aside, so Locke could lead the conversation. The door opened, and Locke saw a young girl in baggy clothes with stringy brown hair and red bloodshot eyes. It looked like she'd been awake for days, and he suddenly felt for this teenager, whose life he knew he was about to change completely. He introduced himself and told her he had something important to tell her, but that she should sit down first. He watched as Clara nervously backed up and then sat on the edge of her bed. Then, Locke took a deep breath, and in a quiet and steady voice, he told Clara the news. Her father was dead. For what felt like a very long time, the room was completely silent. Clara stared blankly at Locke, for so long that Locke started to wonder if she'd even understood him. But right before Locke was about to ask her if she was okay, Clara's eyes seemed to snap back into focus, and she finally spoke. She asked how did her dad die. And now, Locke hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He knew he had to be mindful about how much he revealed about the crime, even to the victim's closest family members. Everyone was a possible suspect until they were ruled out. So, Locke told Clara that her father had been found dead inside of his home, and what happened to him was a question they were investigating. Clara went back to staring blankly. Locke could tell Clara was in some kind of shock, and so there was no way he was going to leave her alone. So he asked her to come with him because now they had to go and tell her sister, Michelle. A few minutes later, Locke stood inside of Michelle's dorm room as Michelle screamed the word no over and over again while Clara tried to comfort her. So far, telling the kids had been just as heart-wrenching as Locke had expected. Notifications were one of the hardest parts of his job, especially in a murder, because Locke couldn't just comfort them and leave. Instead, he had to stay and question them, no matter how upset they were. Locke looked at Michelle and Clara and decided that of the two of them, Clara was in much better shape to be interviewed. So he asked her to please step out of the room so he could ask her a few questions. Clara nodded, and Locke led her out into the hallway to a quiet corner near the stairwell where it felt like they had some privacy. He pulled out his notepad and asked Clara when she last talked to her father. Clara looked down at the floor and shook her head sadly. Friday, she said. They had talked about her coming home for the holidays in a few weeks. Then she paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. She said that during that last conversation, she and her father had fought. She had a car, but it was back at the farmhouse, and she wanted to bring it to school, but her dad wouldn't let her. She looked up at Locke and told him that she didn't know why she had gotten so upset at him. Her dad had promised to consider it over the holidays, so she didn't even know why she blew up at him. Now, her final conversation with her father would always be this stupid argument. Locke watched as Clara dropped her head again. He felt sorry for the stunned and awkward teenager. He told Clara he hated to keep pressing, but he needed to know about her father's friends and relationships, and about the people that she and her siblings hung out with. He asked if anyone they knew might have had some kind of grudge against her father. At this, Clara screwed up her face in what looked like deep concentration. Then she slowly listed off the names of some of her dad's closest friends, but said none of them had a grudge, and most of her friends had either never met her dad, or if they had, they really liked him. But then, Locke watched as Clara's expression changed. It looked like she had just remembered something else, and suddenly she looked straight at Locke with a focus in her eyes that he hadn't seen until now. She said one of her friends had recently met her dad over Thanksgiving break, and ever since then, he'd been acting really strange and intense. She told Locke that his name was Kyle Hulbert. He was 18, and they had met at a Renaissance fair a few months earlier. They'd gotten along really well at first, but over the last several weeks, his whole demeanor had changed, although she didn't know why. He'd actually gotten busted on a concealed weapons charge for carrying daggers around a shopping mall, and after that, Clara said she had tried to avoid him. At the mention of daggers, Locke's eyes narrowed. This murder case involved an unusual blade as the murder weapon, and while daggers weren't long like the murder weapon, they were an unusual knife to carry, especially at the mall. Locke's disappointment over the teenagers and the tow truck disappeared as he underlined Kyle Hulbert and daggers in his pad. This was a good lead. He told Clara they were almost done, and soon she could go back with her sister and they could tell their brother together. But first, he needed to know the names of Kyle's closest friends. Clara nodded and started listing off names, which Locke wrote down as quickly as he could. But when Clara got to the last name, Locke's pencil froze on the page. Because Locke knew he had heard this name before. Just a few hours earlier, in fact, when he was standing in the tow truck company lobby. It was Michael Foale, the teenage driver of the stuck car. The next day, December 11th, Locke had Michael Foale picked up by police officers when he left his house with his girlfriend in the car. Officers took both of them to the station, put them in separate rooms, and told them to wait. Someone would be in to question them soon. Meanwhile, Locke executed a search warrant at Michael's house, where police seized a desktop computer, 2 black cloaks, multiple knives, a document about human sacrifice, and a sword with a blade more than 2 feet long with little flecks of blood still on the metal. That afternoon, when Locke walked into the interview room where Michael was waiting, he felt like he had a pretty good case. Now, he just needed Michael to talk. And pretty much the second he sat down, Locke got his wish. Michael Foale and his girlfriend agreed to tell Locke everything they knew. But their story was more bizarre and more horrific than Locke or anyone else had expected. In fact, it was so wild and so shocking that it would take several more weeks of investigation before Locke and the rest of the police were able to fully untangle the sequence of events that Michael Foale and his girlfriend sketched out in their interviews that day. But finally, on February 1st, 2002, so almost 2 months after Robert Schwartz's death, the police arrested the mastermind behind the murder. And it was not who the police had expected it to be. Based on interviews, evidence, and transcripts from online and phone conversations, the following is what happened to Dr. Robert Schwartz on the night of Saturday, December 8th, 2001. At around 6:15 p.m., the killer sat in the back seat of a car, driving down a muddy dead-end road in the woods in a rainstorm. The killer's friend, Michael Foale, was driving, and Michael's girlfriend was riding in the front passenger seat. Michael and his girlfriend were both talking because they were trying to find the big old farmhouse that was their destination, but the killer was not paying attention to them. Instead, the killer was completely focused on a different voice, a voice that no one else could hear. The voice was named Nicodemus, and Nicodemus was a god. In fact, Nicodemus was one of 6 gods that had lived inside the killer's head for as long as the killer could remember. And now, Nicodemus had a warning. "Don't go up there," Nicodemus shouted inside of the killer's head. Now, usually, the killer listened to Nicodemus. The killer knew the god was just trying to keep them safe, but tonight, the killer knew they could not back down from their plan. Innocent lives were at stake, because the killer knew something that no one else did. And that was that Dr. Robert Schwartz was a monster. He lashed out with violence even though no one else could see it, and he poisoned lemons and pork with sulfuric acid. And recently, the killer was absolutely certain that Dr. Robert Schwartz had begun planning a murder of his own. The killer knew they had to strike first. So, from the backseat of the car, the killer answered Nicodemus, telling the god in a whisper, "I have to do this." The car came to a stop in the mud in front of Robert Schwartz's farmhouse, and the killer got out wearing a long black trench coat that hid a 27-inch long sword. The killer stalked through the rain up to Robert's front door and started knocking, hard. After a minute, the killer heard footsteps squeaking on old hardwood inside the house, and then the door opened. The killer could smell the dinner that Robert was cooking in the kitchen. Robert stood in the doorway, looking down at the killer in confusion. "Yes?" he asked. The killer asked if Clara was home, and Robert said no. So the killer asked for Clara's phone number, and Robert invited the killer inside out of the rain while he wrote it down. And this was when the killer decided to strike. As Robert stood with his back to the killer, writing out his daughter's phone number, the killer told him, "I know your plans." And as Robert turned in confusion, the killer pulled out the sword and began slashing. Robert tried to protect himself, grabbing for the blade and cutting his hand in the process, spilling blood all over the floor, but the killer was in an unstoppable frenzy. The killer yanked the sword away from Robert and then slashed his stomach. Somehow, Robert stayed standing as the killer swung the sword and sprayed blood across the kitchen. Some of the blood landed in the killer's mouth, and the metallic taste filled the killer with pleasure and adrenaline. The killer slashed Robert over and over until finally Robert fell, landing face down on the hardwood. Robert wasn't moving anymore, and Nicodemus was screaming at the killer to stop, but the killer couldn't stop. Some of Robert's blood had landed on the hot stove, where it was now sizzling, and the smell filled the air as the killer rammed the sword all the way through Robert's body over and over again, sinking the tip of the blade into the hardwood beneath Robert. By the time the killer finished, Robert's clothing was shredded and he had been stabbed more than 30 times. The killer stood over his victim for a minute and then calmly walked over to the stove to turn off the burner. And then before he left the house, as a final touch, the killer took the sword and carved an X into the back of Robert's neck. The killer did this because X was the signature of an assassin in the fantasy game that the killer loved. That fantasy game was called Underworld. Underworld had been created by the killer's best friend, and it was the killer's best friend who was the mastermind behind the murder of Robert Schwartz. In the game of Underworld, the mastermind went by the name High Priestess of Chaos, and the killer was called Assassin. But in the real world, the killer's name was Kyle Hulbert, and the mastermind's name was Clara Schwartz. It would turn out Robert Schwartz's daughter, Clara, had never come out of her depression after the death of her mother. Instead, she sunk deep into misery and also paranoia and became convinced that her father was trying to kill her. And when Clara met Kyle Hulbert at a Renaissance fair, she found a willing player in her dark fantasy world. Kyle was schizophrenic and bipolar, and he'd grown up in foster care and mental hospitals, totally unable to tell the difference between reality and the voices and visions inside of his head. Clara and Kyle, along with Michael Foale and his girlfriend, formed a disturbed little family. They all played characters in Clara's fantasy game, Underworld, and they referred to each other as brother and sister. And over time, Clara had convinced all of them that her father was trying to poison her by lacing lemons and pork with chemicals like sulfuric acid, and that he was ultimately planning to murder her. And so, convinced that Clara was in real danger, Kyle, the underworld assassin, stepped in to protect her. But what Clara did not say to Kyle was that if her father died, she believed she would inherit several $100,000. And so, at Clara and Kyle's instruction, Michael and his girlfriend drove Kyle to Robert Schwartz's house in the rainstorm on December 8, 2001, so that Kyle could stop Robert once and for all. And they might have gotten away with their crime if their car had not gotten stuck in the mud. In the end, Michael Foale was sentenced to 18 years in prison for his role in the murder. His girlfriend accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to just 1 year. Kyle pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and conspiracy and was sentenced to life in prison. And although Clara Schwartz tried to pin the whole murder on Kyle by dropping his name and the story about his arrest for carrying daggers to investigator Locke, she was ultimately caught when police read transcripts of her online and phone conversations with Kyle and her other friends. It was clear that Clara herself was the driving force behind the murder of her father. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy and sentenced to 48 years in prison. In a final twist, it was the DNA research that Dr. Robert Schwartz himself had spent his career on, which helped investigators to determine that the blood on the sword belonged to Robert. On December 7th, 1993, a pregnant woman named Diane Schaap sat inside of a hospital room in the city of Fulda, Germany, staring anxiously at the nurse who was doing her blood pressure. When the nurse was done, she would tell Diane that her blood pressure was still too high. And so Diane, she sighed and she was pretty upset by this, but at the same time, she wasn't all that shocked. After all, Diane had come to the hospital because she thought something was wrong with her. Diane was an American who lived on the nearby Sickles Army Airfield Base along with her husband, Sergeant Stephen Schaap. And that morning, Diane had begun to bleed, and because she had a history of miscarriages, she panicked and just rushed to the hospital to get checked out. Now, ultimately, the doctors would tell her that it seemed like she was going to be okay and that the bleeding was not a big issue, but as a precaution, they wanted her to stay in the hospital for a week, just doing bed rest, where they could watch her and make sure she was really okay. And so far, she was, but her blood pressure was still too high. The nurse who had taken Diane's blood pressure finished doing the rest of Diane's vitals, and then afterwards, she left the room, leaving Diane alone. And Diane, now, it's the first time she's been alone inside of her hospital room since she arrived, and suddenly she just felt so anxious about the whole situation. And so as she's laying in her bed, wondering if her pregnancy was really okay, she heard footsteps out in the hallway, and then suddenly her door busted open, and it was her husband, Stephen. And Stephen, his skin was pale, his eyes were red, he looked really upset, and he rushed into the room and he kneeled down next to Diane's bed and he took her hand and he just said, how are you doing? It had been a really hard stretch lately for Diane and Stephen. Just a few months earlier, Diane had actually asked Stephen for a divorce because she felt like Stephen had grown distant and the love was just not there anymore in their relationship. As for Stephen, he didn't want the divorce. He felt like the relationship was still good, they still loved each other, but he understood Diane was clearly unhappy, and so he was very gentlemanly about this whole situation, and even went with Diane to the base's cleric, where they arranged for Diane to be sent back to the United States while Stephen stayed in Germany. But before Diane was able to make that move back home, she had discovered that she was pregnant. Now, Diane knew Stephen really wanted to reconcile and get back together, and especially now that he had found out she was pregnant, he really wanted them to get back together so he could be the dad. But Diane knew that just was not possible. Their relationship just didn't work, and so she needed to be firm, and so she actually squeezed Stephen's hand as he's sitting there right next to her, and she just said to him, even though he hadn't brought it up, she said, we can't get back together, even though I'm pregnant. It can't happen. But Stephen just kind of shook his head at her like he was not here for that reason. And he said, look, I just want to be your friend. Let me go back to your house. I'll gather up your things and bring them here to make your stay a little bit more comfortable. And so Diane, who wanted to tell Stephen, no, don't do that. I'm fine. She could just tell that he really wanted to help her. And so kind of against her better judgment, Diane said, okay, Stephen, if you want to go back and get my stuff, I would really appreciate it. And at that, Stephen stood up and he gave Diane a long hug and said, I'll be right back. And then he turned and left the room. A few hours later, at around 5 p.m. that evening, the phone inside of Diane's room began to ring. And so Diane answered it, and it was her husband's best friend, Gregory Glover. And he was calling just to check in on Diane because he had heard she was in the hospital about some bleeding, and he wanted to make sure the baby was okay. And Diane would tell him that, it seems like everything's fine. And then after that, Gregory would tell Diane that he was really worried about Stephen. He said, this morning I had driven him to work, and all he did was pour his heart out to me about how he wanted to get back together with you. And I just want you to know that, he's really worked up about this. But before Diane could even respond to Gregory, the phone just suddenly went dead. And so Diane, she held the phone out, kind of staring at it like, what's going on here? She put it back to her ear. She said Greg's name a few more times, but the line was just totally dead. And so Diane, she hung up the phone and figured Gregory would just call back. But 30 minutes went by and Gregory did not call back. And then out in the hallway, Diane began to hear running. And that running continued all the way up the hall and it stopped right outside of her door. And so she turned to face her door, the door flung open, and what she saw caused Diane to just freeze in total shock. A few hours earlier, after Stephen had left Diane's hospital room, he had gone straight to her house to begin gathering things up for her. And so when he got there, he had a gym bag, which was made by a sports and athletic company called Head, and he had gone inside of her house and begun going around the rooms, gathering things she would want, and putting them in this bag. And at some point, Stephen made his way into Diane's bedroom, and suddenly he was just kind of overcome with sadness because he looked around the room and he saw there were still pictures up from their wedding day, and there was a card that was face down on the bedside table that he recognized. And just all of these different things he was seeing just suddenly made him feel so depressed about losing his marriage. And so Stephen, instead of continuing to gather up things for Diane, he just began pacing back and forth inside of her bedroom, thinking about ways he could potentially win Diane back. Maybe there was a gift he could give her or some sort of offering or gesture that would show her that he still loved her very much. And so as Stephen was thinking about this, he happened to glance down at his gym bag, and suddenly he felt totally inspired, like he knew exactly what he needed to do. And so without another thought, Stephen grabbed something off of the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom, he threw it inside of his gym bag, then he grabbed the bag and walked out of her house. Once Stephen was outside, he had a big smile on his face, he was even whistling as he walked, and he went down and he got into his car and he drove off. But instead of going to the hospital where Diane was, Stephen began driving in these weird loops all around Sickles Army Airfield Base, almost like he was going on a joyride. But as he was driving, Stephen was constantly scanning left and right, like he was looking for something. And then at some point, as he did one of his many loops, Stephen passed by the mess hall, the cafeteria, and he saw all the soldiers going in and out of this mess hall, and he thought, oh, that's where it will be. The thing I need is inside of there. And so Stephen, he parked his car, he got out, and he rushed inside of the mess hall, but after looking all around, he couldn't find the thing he wanted. And so frustrated, he turned and walked out of the mess hall. But when he went back outside, as he was walking back to his car, something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention, and he looked over, and it was this phone booth right on the sidewalk up against the road. And he couldn't believe it, but there it was. There was the thing right near this phone booth that Stephen desperately wanted. And so Stephen, instead of going to his car, just began walking in a straight, very determined line towards this phone booth. 30 minutes later, Diane heard those running footsteps out in the hallway, and then her door flung open and she froze in shock at what she saw. Because what she saw was her husband, and he had this totally crazed look on his face, like he was smiling, but kind of deranged, and he was holding that Head gym bag. And he walked in holding the bag and just stared directly at Diane, and then he opened it up, he reached inside, and he pulled out his special gift. The thing he had been driving all around base for that he had found inside of that phone booth, and he walked up to Diane and he put it right in her face and said, look what I brought you, look. And by this point, Diane was screaming bloody murder. It would turn out when Stephen first arrived at Diane's hospital room that morning and he had knelt down and taken her hand and asked if she was okay, Diane had been very firm with him that they could still not get back together even though she was pregnant. Now, this was crushing news for Stephen because he did secretly hope that this baby would bring them back together, but what Diane told Stephen next was infinitely more crushing. She would say to Stephen that the real reason they could not get back together was because this baby was not his. Now, Stephen had initially taken this news pretty well and said to Diane, okay, I understand, at least let me go to your house and gather up some things for you and bring them back here so your stay at the hospital is a little bit more comfortable. And Diane had maybe been a little bit surprised at how well Stephen had taken this, and she said, okay, yeah, that would be great. And so Stephen had left the hospital, gone to Diane's house, he went into her room, and he began putting her things into that gym bag when suddenly he stopped because he noticed those pictures on the mantelpiece of their wedding day, and it was just kind of crushing to realize that his marriage really was over. And then, before he went back to packing, he happened to glance over at the bedside table, and he noticed a card face down on that table. Now, at first, Stephen actually didn't really react to this card because he knew who had given it to Diane. It was just a friend of hers, and the card was kind of meaningless. It was just a card to celebrate their friendship. But then Stephen's suddenly thinking to himself, wait a minute. This person, this friend of Diane's, gives her cards all the time. And this person is always coming over to say hi to Diane. And this person's always complimenting Diane and telling me how great Diane is. And it was like suddenly everything just kind of fell into place for Stephen. And he realized this so-called friend of Diane's was much more than that. This friend was Diane's lover and very likely the father of her unborn child. And who was this friend of Diane's? Well, none other than Stephen's very best friend, Gregory Glover. The same Gregory Glover that Stephen just that morning had poured his heart out to on the ride to work, telling Gregory how much he missed his wife and how much he wanted to reconcile. And Gregory's advice to Stephen had been, well, I know you're hurting, but you really need to let this go. You need to let the divorce happen and just move on with your life. And now Stephen realized that Gregory wanted Stephen to end his relationship with his wife so Gregory could have a relationship with Diane. And so Stephen felt unbelievably betrayed, and that was when he decided to get a gift for Diane. And so he grabbed a knife that was on the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom. He threw it inside of his gym bag. He got in his car and he began driving around the base looking for Gregory. And after Stephen had gone into the mess hall and then come back out again, he had spotted Gregory on the phone inside of that phone booth. And Stephen had immediately run over, opened it up, grabbed Gregory, pulled him out, and begun stabbing him. Now, Stephen didn't know this, but at the time he attacked Greg was literally on the phone with Diane. And so when that call suddenly dropped and Diane expected Gregory to call her back, well, their call really hadn't dropped. It was just that Gregory had been pulled away and was being attacked. Gregory, who was totally caught off guard, tried his best to defend himself against Stephen, but Stephen was just crazed and he kept hacking away until finally Gregory had stopped moving. And then at some point, Stephen stood up and kind of caught his breath and he's looking around at all these onlookers who can't believe what they're seeing. And Stephen said, I'm sorry. He grabbed some things off the ground, put them inside of his head bag, and then he took the bag, he ran to his car, drove to the hospital, ran through the hospital to Diane's room. He flung the door open and Diane is shocked to see him. And Stephen walks in with this crazed look on his face and he holds up the bag, he unzips it and pulls out Gregory's severed head. And he holds it right in front of Diane and says, look what I brought you, look. And he placed it down right on the bedside table, looking directly at Diane. And so Diane began screaming and people began rushing into the room. Meanwhile, Stephen just sat in the corner calmly, waiting to be arrested. Ultimately, Stephen would be tried by a military court and he would be sentenced to life in prison.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Snowball Effect.
On the evening of December 20th, 2022, a young woman named Moon Soo-ho, along with her boyfriend, whose name was Lee Ki-young, sat at a table at a Korean barbecue restaurant in northern Seoul, which is the capital city of South Korea. The couple didn't even have any food yet, but Moon was not even looking at the menu. Instead, she was excitedly checking her watch, waiting for her parents to arrive. This dinner was a very special occasion for Moon because she had been dating Lee for several months now and she was totally in love with him, but she had not introduced him to her parents yet. And so Lee had surprised her with reservations to this restaurant tonight for 4 people. He had invited her parents to come to the dinner so they could all finally meet. Moon looked across the table at Lee and she smiled because she knew as soon as her parents saw this guy, they were going to be impressed. Lee was a 32-year-old Army veteran with lots of crazy stories from his time in the military. He was also exceptionally good-looking, he was very well-educated, and he came from a family that was extremely successful and very wealthy. Lee's grandfather owned the high-rise building that Lee was staying in. I mean, this family was very influential and powerful in South Korea. But Lee was not full of himself. He was very humble, he was kind and polite, and he had a total soft spot for little animals. He had adopted a dog and 3 cats and adored them. I mean, this was a guy who was kind of like the total package that any parent would be psyched that their daughter was dating. After Moon and Lee had been sitting at this table for about 15 minutes, Moon looked up and she saw her parents finally coming in the door. And so Moon, she stood up and she waved to her parents and flagged them over to the table. And so they came over, they said hi to Lee. And right away, Lee, he picked up the menu and he ordered all these very expensive drinks and all the expensive meats on the menu. And then before long, Lee was chatting with Moon's father about his military service. And then Lee was talking to Moon's mother and showing her pictures of his dog and his 3 cats. And Moon, she was just sitting back, enjoying watching this because she could see from her parents' facial expressions that they seemed to really like Lee too. And so this night was going as good as it could have. Moon and Lee and Moon's parents stayed at this restaurant for at least 2 hours, just enjoying each other's company and throwing back a lot of drinks and eating expensive food. And by the end of the night, when the parents got up to leave, they were like hugging Lee and slapping him on the back and telling him how great he was. And Lee was doing the same thing to the parents. It was like really they had hit it off. But after Moon's parents were gone, Moon and Lee, they left the restaurant too, and they began walking across the street towards the parking garage where Lee had parked. And right away, Moon could tell Lee was actually pretty drunk. She had not noticed it in the restaurant, but now she could see Lee was kind of stumbling a little bit. But Moon wasn't upset about this. If anything, she just thought, wow, he was so composed talking to my parents in there, despite obviously being drunk. He had just managed to mask it really, really well. But despite how impressed she was with her boyfriend, Moon didn't want Lee to drive them home. It seemed like that would be really unsafe to do because, again, obviously he is drunk. And so when Lee and Moon made it to Lee's car, Moon kind of gently told Lee, hey, why don't we leave your car here and just call a taxi and they can take us home safely. But when she said this, Lee took it as if Moon was criticizing him for being too drunk. And he felt really offended because in his mind, he had just put on this great date and made this great first impression on Moon's parents. And here she is kind of nagging him. And so Lee just kind of blew his lid and the couple got in this horrible yelling fight in the parking garage, which ended with Lee telling Moon that their relationship was now over. And then Lee turned around and stormed off to hail a cab by himself. And after he was gone, Moon just stood there next to Lee's car being totally shocked at what had just happened. And then kind of in a daze, she went and hailed a cab herself and went home. And then she just laid in bed and cried until she went to sleep. But Moon was not heartbroken for long because the next morning when Moon woke up, she heard a knock on the front door. And when she opened it up, there was a delivery guy with this huge, beautiful bouquet of roses for Moon. And so Moon took these roses and quickly found a card attached to the roses. She opened it up and there was a letter from Lee saying, please accept these roses as a part of my apology. Last night didn't go so well. I'm really sorry. Please come to dinner with me tonight. Moon was so relieved to get this apology letter that she called Lee right away and said, you know what? I do forgive you. It's all water under the bridge. My parents, they loved you and they have no idea about that fight we had. So let's just put it behind us and just continue being boyfriend and girlfriend. And at this point, it was Lee's turn to be totally relieved because he didn't know if Moon would want him back. But they were back together, and that night they went out for a fancy dinner together, and then also Lee had booked a very fancy hotel room that night for them to stay in. And this is really how their relationship went for the next couple of days. Basically, Lee would take Moon out shopping anywhere she wanted to go. They went to all the best restaurants and stayed in the best hotels. To Moon, it was obvious that Lee was really just continuing to shower her with gifts and praise and all these fun things to still try to make up for that big fight they got into, even though Moon really had forgiven him. And at some point, after several days of being treated like a princess by Lee, Moon finally told Lee, stop buying me stuff. It's fine. I totally forgive you. Everything is good. But Lee insisted that he be allowed to continue to spoil her. After all, it was the Christmas season and she deserved to be spoiled around Christmas. So in South Korea, Christmas is celebrated a bit differently than it is in Western countries like America. In South Korea, Christmas is a big holiday, but it's really just a holiday for couples. It's not really a family occasion. So in South Korea, on Christmas, lots of couples will go out on these fancy dates. And so that's kind of how they celebrate Christmas. Whereas, in Western countries like America, it's all about family and waking up and getting presents from Santa Claus. So that's the difference. Western is family-centric, and in South Korea, it's very couple-centric. It's kind of like Valentine's Day in the winter. So, on Christmas Eve, Lee told Moon that he had a very special dinner planned for Christmas, and would Moon mind coming over to Lee's apartment on Christmas morning to feed his cats and his dog, because Lee was going to be out running errands in preparation for this big Christmas dinner. And of course, Moon said she would. So, at around 11 a.m. on Christmas Day, Moon hopped off the elevator inside of Lee's apartment building and began walking down the hall towards his door, carrying the key to his door. But as Moon walked closer and closer to Lee's door, she began smelling this really powerful smell. It smelled like roses. And for a second, Moon thought to herself, oh my goodness, this whole thing was a setup. I'm not here to feed his pets. I'm here because he must have planned some really elaborate thing for Christmas Day for right now. And probably it has to do with lots of roses inside of his apartment. And so Moon was really excited by the time she got out front of Lee's apartment door, but before she used her key to open it up and just go in, she decided she would just call out for Lee, because she figured at this point, he's got to be in there. He knows I'm about to be surprised by this big thing. And so she calls out for Lee, but there's no answer. And so she knocks a couple of times to see if maybe she can get Lee to come to the door, but after knocking several times, there was no answer. So eventually, Moon used her key, she opened up the door, she swung it open, and she stepped inside of Lee's apartment, expecting to be wowed by whatever Lee had planned, but instead, when she looked around, she couldn't really understand what she was even seeing. Lee was nowhere to be found, but there were roses all over the apartment. However, these were not new roses. These were like several days old. Many of them were wilted and the petals were starting to fall off. And the water that all these roses were sitting in was very dirty. But really, there were like vases of roses everywhere on every surface. And right away, Moon started to feel really uneasy. It was like very creepy to be in this dark apartment where no one's inside of, with just these weird flowers everywhere. And so without going any further into the apartment, Moon once again yelled out for Lee in hopes that maybe he was here, but again, he didn't come out of any of the rooms, so she knows she's alone. And so she called Lee on his phone to try to get an explanation for what she was looking at. But Lee didn't answer his phone. By this point, Lee's 3 cats were circling around Moon's legs because they were eager to be fed, and so Moon kind of stopped thinking about this strange flower situation and looked over at the cats' bowls and saw there was no dry food. They had eaten all of their food. And so Moon began walking over to the bowls when she realized Lee had not told her where he kept the cat food, and so she had no idea where it was. So Moon began opening all the kitchen cabinets, hoping to find this cat food somewhere, but she didn't. And so eventually she left the kitchen and she walked down this hallway inside of the apartment, and she found there was a skinny closet in the hallway that looked like a place where you would store cleaning supplies and vacuums and that sort of thing. So she reached down and tried to open it. She was able to turn the doorknob, but there was something inside of this closet that was making it really hard to open, like it was stuck on something. Now, again, Moon is kind of looking around this dark, dingy apartment that's filled with all these wilted roses, and she's feeling super uneasy, but she thought, I just want to feed these cats and just get out of here. And so Moon just grabbed that door handle and yanked as hard as she could, and she managed to pop it open. And for a second, Moon just stared at the inside of the closet, having no idea what she was even looking at. And then she started to scream. It would turn out virtually everything Moon thought she knew about Lee, her boyfriend, was wrong. 5 days earlier, after Moon and Lee had gotten into that horrible fight in the parking garage following the dinner with Moon's parents, Lee had made it seem like he was storming off to go hail a cab and drive home on his own. But in reality, after he stormed off, he waited for Moon to walk away and get a cab on her own, and then Lee just walked right back over to where he had parked his car in the parking garage. He got inside, turned it on, and began driving home. But on his drive home, he actually crashed into a taxi driver. Now, neither Lee nor the taxi driver were harmed in this accident, and both cars were still drivable, but Lee actually had a really big problem with drinking and driving. 9 years earlier, in 2013, when Lee was serving in the military, he was put in military prison for drunk driving. And then after he got out of the military, he was arrested 2 more times for drunk driving in 2018 and 2019. And so even though this accident with the taxi driver was very minor, Lee did not want to go to police and report this accident because if officials got involved, they would see that Lee has this horrible history of drunk driving and he would get in way more trouble. And so Lee convinced the taxi driver to just allow him to pay him privately for the damages in order to avoid getting officials involved. However, the taxi driver, who was open to this, demanded that Lee pay him in cash. He didn't want some sort of deferred payment plan. He wanted to be paid now. And so Lee said, okay, well then let's go to my apartment and I'll just pay you there. However, when the taxi driver and Lee got to Lee's apartment, they got in a fight over how much money Lee actually needed to pay the taxi driver for the damages. And eventually, Lee just kind of snapped and beat the taxi driver to death and then stuffed his body inside of that cleaning closet in his apartment's hallway. And so that's what Moon had seen when she had opened up that closet. She saw the corpse of the taxi driver. And then after Lee had murdered the taxi driver, he stole the taxi driver's credit cards and his cell phone, and Lee would use the taxi driver's credit card to pay for all those lavish dinners and hotel stays and gifts over the next few days as Lee spoiled Moon for Christmas. And also during that time, Lee was using the taxi driver's cell phone to send messages to the taxi driver's family to convince them that he was still alive. Also, Lee went out and bought a whole bunch of bouquets of roses and put them all over his apartment to try to mask the smell of the rotting corpse inside of his closet. But this murder and Lee's horrible drunk driving were not his only secrets. Lee claimed he was from this very wealthy, successful family that owned all these amazing high-rises in South Korea, but that was all a big lie. Lee was not from a very successful family. He did not have any money. He basically just borrowed money from family and friends and then lied about how he acquired the money, claiming he was this big, successful, wealthy guy. Also, when the police in South Korea began investigating the taxi driver's murder, they discovered that Lee's apartment was not even his. It belonged to his ex-girlfriend, who was a bartender in South Korea who was in her 50s. Also, Lee's beloved 3 cats and dog that he talked about all the time, about how much he loved them and cared for them, well, those weren't his either. Those were his ex-girlfriend's. And as police continued their investigation into the murder of this taxi driver, they would eventually find traces of Lee's ex-girlfriend's blood inside of Lee's apartment, so his ex-girlfriend's apartment. And they would discover that Lee had murdered his ex-girlfriend, stolen her apartment, stolen her pets, and even took her cell phone, and to this day had been sending messages to her family to try to convince them that she was still alive, even though nobody had seen her and had no idea what was going on with her. Lee was ultimately arrested for 2 counts of murder, and he would quickly admit that he did kill the taxi driver and his ex-girlfriend. However, by this point, police had located the cell phone of a missing woman amongst Lee's things, and so they became very suspicious that he might have had something to do with this 3rd woman's disappearance. However, to this day, Lee has denied having anything to do with this missing woman, and they still have no idea what happened to her. And so that case is kind of on hold. Despite how totally crazy this whole story sounds, the craziest part actually happened after Lee was arrested. Once Lee's crimes were being talked about all over the news, Lee became totally famous in South Korea because he was exceptionally good looking. On the news, they would play CCTV footage of Lee interacting with that taxi driver before he murdered him. And the only takeaway from lots of people in South Korea was, wow, this guy is so unbelievably attractive. He looks like an actor. Not, here's a guy who's about to murder someone. In fact, Lee became so popular in South Korea for being so beautiful that there became a real fear that Lee's ex-girlfriend, Moon, would become a target in some way. That maybe Lee's fans would blame her for putting their beloved Lee in prison and they might try to attack her. However, the police in South Korea did a really good job of masking Moon's identity, and so to this day, we believe she is still safe. And also, for clarity, Moon is actually not her real name. That is a pseudonym that we used to protect her identity as well. In the end, Lee was sentenced to life in prison for those 2 murders.
I was a lost soul until I followed you home. The crowd, it slows down. Cars crash and pull over. Because you glow, I don't wanna be sober. If this is a show, then you are the show closer. This overcrowded life becomes less crowded when I follow you home. The crowd is a sea. Everyone is drowning, but you find me. Hope is so easy. You show that I could be. Why would you ever leave?
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, Mr. Ballin Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today,